What's your stance on capital punishment? Well, there are different resolutions of thought on this. There's firstly the question of whether somebody should ever be essentially deserving of death for certain crimes that they've committed. But secondly, there's this question of whether the institution of capital punishment, practically speaking, is something that we should advocate for. As far as the first question is concerned, this is going to be complicated for me by the fact that I don't believe that free will exists. If you're interested in why, I'll leave some links in the description and in the little cards up there. But yeah, I don't believe that free will exists. So I think that the idea of retribution, as traditionally thought of, isn't really going to work in this instance. So a lot of the advocacy for capital punishment takes the form of saying something like, these people deserve it, right? By committing horrible crimes like rape and murder, they essentially forfeit their right to life and they deserve to be killed for what they've done. And I can understand this sentiment. I mean, after all, by putting someone in prison, you're spending taxpayers' money, essentially allowing this person to continue living until they die of natural causes many, many years from now. And why should we be paying for the sustenance of someone like that who's committed such a horrible crime when we could just kill them and save us all a lot of money and time? Well, firstly, I'm not entirely thrilled about giving the state the legitimacy to kill people as it sees fit. I mean, who's going to determine which crimes are those that are deserving of capital punishment? But perhaps more troublingly is the way that capital punishment can be used as a kind of political tool, such as in the example of Ricky Ray Rector. Ricky Ray Rector was executed in the early 90s by the state of Arkansas for the murder of a police officer. But the case is quite a controversial one because Rector actually attempted suicide. He tried to shoot himself and essentially gave himself a lobotomy in the process, obviously completely destroying his cognitive capacities. When he received his last meal, he'd requested pecan pie as a dessert. He left that dessert on the side, telling the officers who were taking him to the execution chamber that he was saving it for later. This story is obviously tragic enough already, but what makes it only worse is that many have thought, including people like Christopher Hitchens, that the reason this execution took place when it did was because it happened to coincide with the 1992 presidential election, and Bill Clinton personally made a point of going to Arkansas to oversee the execution of Ricky Ray Rector, presumably to score some points in his home state. Okay, so that's one thing, but I think the most primary concern that I have with capital punishment are cases of miscarriages of justice. Okay, at least in the case of life imprisonment, there's at least some chance that if someone has been wrongfully imprisoned, some kind of amends can be made. They can at least be freed, perhaps given some money, something like that. Whereas obviously, if you take someone's life, there's no coming back from that. Right? And a person's life is the greatest thing. It's the most that you can take from them. And so in an ideal, quote-unquote, world where we could know for a fact who was guilty and who was innocent, maybe there'd be a more concrete discussion to be had about the ethics of capital punishment. But as far as I'm concerned, until we have what I think is the unavoidable prospect of innocent people sometimes being charged for crimes they didn't commit, the idea of anybody being put to death as a result of such an instance is too horrific to even spend any time thinking about. And I think that that alone should give us reason to reject the institution, the political institution of capital punishment, even if we think that in principle it can be justified.